I was standing in the break room at the UPS distribution center on Northside Drive in Atlanta when I saw my son's face on someone's phone screen. It was 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March, and I just finished loading my 200th package of the shift. The young kid next to me, couldn't have been more than 22, was scrolling through Instagram, and there was my son Mike Cameron standing in front of a Tesla, wearing a suit that cost more than I made in 2 weeks, with a caption that read, "Self-made CEO, no handouts, just hustle." I felt something crack inside my chest that had nothing to do with the physical labor I'd been doing for the past 6 hours. My name is Marcus Jonathan Sullivan. I'm 58 years old, and I've worked a night shift at UPS for the past 32 years. Before anyone clicks away, let me ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop that in the comments, because I want to know this story is reaching people who understand what sacrifice really means. And if you're new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Leave a like if you've ever worked a job that nobody saw, that nobody celebrated, but that kept everything else standing, because that's what this story is about. I need to take you back 4 years to help you understand how I ended up staring at that phone screen at nearly 4 in the morning, questioning every decision I'd made as a father. Back in January of 2022, Cameron came to me with what he called the opportunity of a lifetime. He was 26 years old then. I'd graduated from Morehouse College 3 years earlier with a degree in business administration, and had been bouncing between marketing jobs that never quite seemed to fit. He had this idea for a digital marketing platform that would help small Black-owned businesses compete with bigger companies online. The concept was solid, I'll give him that. He'd done his research, put together a business plan that was 73 pages long, and had the kind of fire in his eyes that reminded me of myself at that age. "Dad," he said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table of my modest 3-bedroom house in southwest Atlanta, "I need $300,000 to get this off the ground. I've talked to investors, but they want to see proof of concept first. They want to see that I can build the platform, get clients, show traction. But I can't do any of that without initial capital." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were projections, market analysis, competitive research. The kid had done his homework. "I know you've been saving. I know Mom put money away before she passed. I'm not asking for a gift, Dad. I'm asking for an investment. I'll pay you back with interest. 20% return within 5 years. My wife, Patricia, had passed away from breast cancer in 2019. We'd been married for 34 years, and she'd been the one who always managed our finances, who made sure we saved 15% of every paycheck, who clipped coupons and found deals and turned our modest income into something substantial. When she died, she left me with $287,000 in savings, a paid-off house, and a promise I'd made to her on her deathbed. Take care of Cameron. Make sure he has opportunities we never had. So when my son sat across from me asking for help to chase his dream, I heard Patricia's voice in my head saying the same thing she'd said 1,000 times when Cameron was growing up. "That boy is going places, Marcus. We just need to make sure he has the chance to get there." I didn't give him an answer that night. I spent the next week thinking about it, praying on it at Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Patricia and I had been members for 27 years. Talking to my older brother Gerald, who'd retired from Delta Airlines and knew a thing or two about financial decisions. Gerald was skeptical. "Man, that's your retirement money," he told me over beers at his house in Stone Mountain. "You're 54 years old. You got maybe 10 more years of throwing boxes around before your back gives out completely. What happens if his business fails?" And most of them do, Marcus. The statistics aren't pretty. But when I closed my eyes at night, I saw Patricia's face, heard her voice, remembered the promise. 3 weeks later, I transferred $310,000 to Cameron's business account at SunTrust Bank, $300,000 for the business, and $10,000 as a cushion for his first few months of living expenses while he got things running. I kept $42,000 for myself as an emergency fund. I was making $54,000 a year at UPS with my supervisor position, so I figured I could rebuild savings over time. Cameron cried when I told him. Actually cried. Hugged me in a way he hadn't since he was a little boy. "Dad, I'm going to make you so proud," he said. "I'm going to build something that honors Mom's memory, that proves you didn't work all those night shifts for nothing. I promise you." The first year was exciting, I'll admit. Cameron would come by every few weeks with updates. He'd hired 2 developers, rented a small office space in Buckhead, signed his first 3 clients. He showed me the website, the platform interface, the marketing materials. Everything looked professional, legitimate. He was working 80-hour weeks, sleeping on the office couch some nights, fully immersed in building something from nothing. I was proud. More than proud. I was vindicated in my decision. This was what Patricia and I had worked for, to give our son a shot at something bigger than what we'd had. But somewhere in year 2, something shifted. Cameron's visits became less frequent. When he did stop by, he talked less about the business challenges and more about the lifestyle, the networking events, the entrepreneur mixers, the conferences in Miami and Las Vegas. He traded his reliable Honda Accord for a leased BMW 3 Series. Started wearing expensive watches. His Instagram account, which he'd initially set up just to promote the business, became filled with motivational quotes, photos of him at upscale restaurants, and captions about the entrepreneur grind and building an empire. I remember one Sunday afternoon in August of 2023. I was at his office dropping off some dinner I'd made Patricia's chicken and rice recipe that Cameron had always loved. His 2 employees were there, young guys in their 20s, and I overheard them talking about Cameron. "Man, I don't know where he gets all his funding from," one of them said. "We've only got like 12 clients, but he's acting like we're pulling in 7 figures. The other one laughed. "Right? And did you see he posted about being self-made yesterday? Like, bro, somebody is backing this operation. No way he's financing all this on client revenue alone." I stood outside the door for a moment, the container of food growing heavy in my hands, before I knocked and went in. I didn't say anything that day. Didn't bring it up. Cameron was animated, showing me the latest features they'd added to the platform, talking about a potential major client that could be worth $80,000 in annual revenue. He seemed happy, driven, focused. I told myself that every entrepreneur has to project confidence, has to look successful to attract success. That's what I'd read in the business books I'd been checking out from the library, trying to understand his world better. So I smiled, told him I was proud, and went back to my night shift where I loaded packages and sorted freight and tried not to think about those young men's conversation. By year 3, Cameron had almost completely stopped visiting me at home. Our interactions moved primarily to social media, which felt like a strange way to keep up with your own son. But I followed his Instagram religiously, checking it during my breaks at work, looking at the life he was building. And it was on Instagram where the self-made narrative really took root. Post after post about how he bet on himself, how he'd started from nothing, how he built his empire without asking for permission or handouts. There were photos of him speaking on panels about entrepreneurship, attending galas for young black business leaders, being featured in local Atlanta magazines as an up-and-coming tech founder. Each post felt like a small betrayal, but I rationalized it. Maybe he was embarrassed that his dad worked a blue-collar job. Maybe in the world of tech entrepreneurs, having a father who loaded trucks didn't fit the narrative. Maybe he was trying to inspire other young people by showing them it was possible to succeed. I made excuses because the alternative, that my son was deliberately erasing my sacrifice, was too painful to fully accept. So I kept working my night shifts, kept depositing my modest paycheck into my account, kept watching the life I'd funded from a distance while pretending it didn't bother me. The breaking point came in November of 2024. I'd picked up extra shifts during the holiday season. UPS always needed additional help from Thanksgiving through New Year's, and the overtime pay was good. I was working 6 nights a week, sometimes pulling 12-hour shifts, because my emergency fund had dwindled to $13,000, and I was starting to feel vulnerable. At 58, with occasional back pain and knee issues that were getting worse, I knew I needed more cushion. My brother Gerald had been on me about it for months. "Marcus, you gave away your safety net," he kept saying. "What happens if you get hurt? What happens if they downsize? You're not 25 anymore." It was during one of those 12-hour shifts, at around 2:30 a.m. on November 18th, when I saw the Instagram post that changed everything. Cameron had posted a photo from what looked like a fancy restaurant canoe, based on the location tag, a place I'd heard about but never been to because entrees started at $40. He was with 3 other young men in expensive suits, and the caption read, "Building a business is a lonely journey. No handouts, no shortcuts, no safety net. Just vision, execution, and the courage to bet everything on yourself. Self-made or nothing." Hashtag entrepreneur. Hashtag tech founder. Hashtag black excellence. Hashtag no excuses. I sat down on a stack of empty pallets and stared at that post for probably 10 minutes. Around me, the distribution center hummed with activity forklifts moving, conveyor belts running, other workers shouting coordinates and package counts. But I was completely still, looking at those words. No safety net. No handouts. I had been his safety net. I had been his handout. $310,000 of my dead wife's sacrifice. Money she'd saved dollar by dollar through decades of careful spending. Money that was supposed to be my security in old age. And he was posting to his 32,000 Instagram followers like he'd done it all alone. Something crystallized in that moment. This wasn't about embarrassment or narrative crafting or inspiration. This was about my son fundamentally not acknowledging what had been given to him, not honoring the sacrifice that had made his dream possible. And more than that, it was about him lying not just through omission, but actively lying about the source of his success. I thought about Patricia, about the promise I'd made to her, about whether this was what she would have wanted. Would she have wanted our son to have opportunity? Absolutely. Would she have wanted him to become someone who denied the people who lifted him up? Never. I finished my shift that morning, drove home as the sun was rising over Atlanta, and sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a clear decision. I wasn't going to confront Cameron with anger or demand gratitude. That wasn't who I was, and it wasn't how Patricia had raised him. But I was going to make sure the truth was known. I'd learned in my 58 years that patience defeats arrogance, that quiet dignity is more powerful than loud confrontation, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is let them face the natural consequences of their choices. I spent the next 3 months doing something I'd never done before. I documented everything. I went to SunTrust Bank and requested copies of all the transfer records showing the $310,000 I'd sent to Cameron's business account in February 2022. I printed out bank statements showing the steady depletion of my savings account from $287,000 to its current $13,000. I created a folder thick, organized, undeniable, that told the complete financial story of how Sullivan Digital Solutions had actually been funded. Not through venture capital or bank loans or betting on himself, but through his father's night shifts and his mother's decades of frugal living. But I didn't do anything with that folder yet. I just prepared it, kept it in my home office, and waited. Because I'd also learned that the truth has a way of demanding to be told at exactly the right moment. You don't force it. You just make sure you're ready when that moment arrives. And I had a feeling it was coming. Cameron's company had been growing, He now had 15 employees, an office that took up the entire second floor of a building in Midtown, and according to his Instagram, he was in talks with major investors for Series A funding. Something was building, and I needed to be ready when it broke. The moment came on February 4th, 2025. Cameron called me for the first time in 6 weeks. He sounded excited, almost manic with energy. "Dad, I need you to hear this. We did it. Sullivan Digital Solutions is about to close a $2 million Series A funding round. $2 million, Dad. We're going to scale nationally. I'm going to be able to hire a full sales team, expand our technology, open offices in other cities. This is it. This is everything I've been working toward." I listened to him talk for 15 minutes about valuations and equity stakes and growth projections. At no point did he mention how he'd gotten to this position. At no point did he acknowledge the foundation on which he built his self-made success. "That's wonderful, son," I said when he finally paused. "When do you close the deal?" He told me the investors wanted to do their due diligence first, that there would be a formal board meeting on March 15th where everything would be finalized, that this was just a formality because they loved the company's trajectory and his vision. "I want you to be there, Dad," he said, and for a moment, I felt that crack in my chest start to heal a little. "I want you to see what I've built. What we've built, I mean. You and Mom made it possible for me to get an education, to have the space to dream. I want you there." I agreed. Told him I'd be there. Told him I was proud of him, which was still true despite everything. Because I was proud of what he'd accomplished with the business itself. The platform was legitimately good. His clients seemed happy. His employees were talented. But I wasn't proud of the lie he'd been living. And I knew that March 15th was going to be the moment of truth. Because if these investors were doing real due diligence, they were going to ask questions. They were going to want to understand the initial capital structure. And they were going to want to know who had funded the first 3 years of operation before the company became profitable. I spent the next 6 weeks preparing myself mentally and emotionally for what was going to happen. I attended church every Sunday, prayed for wisdom and restraint and the right words. I talked to Gerald, who told me I had every right to be angry, but that anger wouldn't serve anyone. "You go in there with those documents," he said, "but you go in there with love too. Because at the end of the day, that's still your son. And maybe this is what he needs to become the man Patricia raised him to be." I thought about that a lot. About how sometimes the most loving thing you can do is hold someone accountable. March 15th, 2025 arrived. The board meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. at Sullivan Digital Solutions office in Midtown. I'd taken a personal day from UPS, something I rarely did, but this was important. I wore my good suit, the navy blue one I bought for Patricia's funeral and had worn maybe 3 times since. I brought the folder with all my documentation, though I kept it in my car initially. I didn't know if I'd need it. I hoped I wouldn't. I hoped that when the investors asked Cameron about his initial funding, he'd tell the truth, that he'd finally acknowledge the sacrifice that had made everything possible. I arrived at the office at 1:45 p.m. The space was impressive. I'll give him that. Glass walls, modern furniture, young people working intently at computers with multiple monitors. Cameron's executive office was in the corner, windows overlooking the Midtown skyline. He greeted me warmly, seemed genuinely happy I was there. "Dad, come meet some people," he said, leading me around the office. I shook hands with developers, account managers, the head of sales. They all spoke highly of Cameron, talked about his vision and leadership. I could see why he was proud of what he'd built. It was real and substantial. At 2 p.m. sharp, we moved into the conference room. 3 investors were there, 2 white men in their 40s and a black woman about Cameron's age. Cameron introduced me as his father, and they were polite, made small talk about my work at UPS. "Cameron told us you've worked there for over 3 decades, the woman said. Her name was Jasmine, and she was a partner at an Atlanta-based venture capital firm. That's incredible dedication. You must be so proud of what Cameron has accomplished. I smiled, said I was, and took my seat at the back of the room. I wasn't part of the meeting officially, just there to observe. The first hour was everything Cameron had described: presentations about user growth, revenue projections, market expansion plans. The investors asked intelligent questions, and Cameron answered them confidently. His team had clearly prepared well. The platform's metrics were genuinely impressive. But then one of the investors, a man named Richard, who ran a tech-focused fund, asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Cameron, I want to go back to the initial funding. Your financial records show that in February 2022, you received a capital injection of $310,000 that allowed you to build the first version of the platform, hire your initial team, and operate for about 18 months before you reached profitability. Can you walk us through where that initial funding came from? Was that an angel investor, personal savings? A loan?" The room went quiet. I watched my son's face, saw the moment of calculation, the split second where he decided what story to tell. And I realized in that moment that I'd been hoping, really, genuinely hoping, that he'd tell the truth. That he'd look at these investors and say, "My father gave me that money. He believed in me when no one else did. He worked night shifts for 30 years and gave me his retirement savings because he saw something in my dream." I was hoping that somewhere in the past 4 years, he developed the character to acknowledge what had been given to him. But that's not what happened. Cameron smiled, leaned back in his chair, and said, "That was personal capital that I accumulated through previous work and smart investing. I'd been saving aggressively for about 5 years, living below my means, putting away 40 to 50% of every paycheck from my marketing positions. I'd also made some strategic investments in cryptocurrency back in 2017, 2018, when Bitcoin was still relatively low, and I liquidated those at the right time. It was a combination of extreme frugality and calculated risk-taking. No outside investors, no loans. Just betting on myself." The lie came out so smoothly, so confidently, that I almost believed it myself for a second. But I knew the truth. I knew that in 2017, Cameron had been barely out of college, working entry-level marketing jobs that paid maybe $38,000 a year. I knew he'd had student loans, car payments, rent in Atlanta's expensive housing market. I knew he hadn't been investing in cryptocurrency because I'd helped him set up a basic budget after Patricia died, and there was no room in it for speculative investments. And I knew, without a doubt, that he'd never accumulated $310,000 through his own work. The investors nodded, made notes, seemed satisfied with the answer. Jasmine smiled and said, "That's exactly the kind of founder we want to back, someone who's willing to bet everything on their vision." The self-made story is powerful, Cameron. It's going to resonate with other entrepreneurs and with the market. Something in me snapped when she said, "self-made." Not in an angry way, but in a way that brought absolute clarity. This wasn't just about me anymore. These investors were about to put $2 million into a company based partly on a lie about its founder's character and financial history. Future employees would be recruited with the same false narrative. Young entrepreneurs would look at Cameron's story and think they'd failed because they didn't have the capital he'd supposedly saved on their own. The lie was going to spread, was going to influence real decisions and real lives. I stood up from my seat at the back of the room. Every head turned toward me. Cameron's face went through several emotions in rapid succession: confusion, then understanding, then fear. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, my voice steady. "But I need to correct something that was just said, because I can't sit here and let this conversation continue based on false information." Richard looked at Cameron, then back at me. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sullivan, but this is a closed meeting. If you have concerns, perhaps Cameron can address them with you privately afterward." I shook my head slowly. No, sir. With respect, this concerns the foundation of your investment decision, and you deserve to know the truth before you commit $2 million. Cameron's face had gone pale. Dad, what are you doing? There was warning in his voice, almost a plea. But I'd made my decision weeks ago, and I'd had 6 weeks to prepare for this exact moment. I wasn't backing down now. I'm telling the truth, son. Something I thought you'd do yourself. I walked to the front of the room, stood beside Cameron's presentation screen. The 3 investors were watching me with a mixture of confusion and interest. Jasmine leaned forward slightly. Mr. Sullivan, what exactly are you saying? I took a breath, thought about Patricia, thought about the 32 years I'd spent loading packages in the middle of the night, thought about the promise I'd made to take care of our son, but also to raise him right. The $310,000 that funded Sullivan Digital Solutions didn't come from my son's savings or cryptocurrency investments. It came from me. I transferred that money to Cameron on February 12, 2022, from my savings account at SunTrust Bank. It was money my late wife Patricia and I had saved over 34 years of marriage. She passed away from breast cancer in 2019, and before she died, she made me promise to give Cameron opportunities we never had. So when he came to me with his business plan, I gave him nearly everything I had. The room was completely silent. Richard had put down his pen. Jasmine's expression had shifted from confusion to sharp attention. The third investor, who hadn't spoken much, was looking at Cameron with a new assessment in his eyes. Cameron stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Dad, this isn't the time or place. But Richard held up his hand. Actually, Cameron, I think this is exactly the time and place. Mr. Sullivan, you're saying you provided the initial capital for this company? Yes, sir. I have all the documentation in my car. Transfer records, bank statements, the works. I can bring it up right now if you'd like to see it. Cameron's voice was tight, almost desperate. Dad, please. Can we talk about this privately? You're embarrassing me in front of my investors. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and felt a deep sadness. No, Cameron, I'm not embarrassing you. You embarrassed yourself when you lied about where your funding came from. I'm just correcting the record. Jasmine spoke up, her voice calm but firm. Mr. Sullivan, would you please go get those documents? We'd like to review them. I nodded, excused myself, and walked out of that conference room with my head high and my heart heavy. I knew what I was doing was going to hurt Cameron in the short term. I knew it was going to potentially cost him this investment, cost him the image he'd carefully constructed. But I also knew that letting the lie continue would cost him something far more valuable, his integrity, his character, the values that Patricia and I had tried to instill in him for 26 years before he started his company. I retrieved the folder from my car, a thick manila envelope containing 3 years of financial documentation. When I returned to the conference room, the atmosphere had completely changed. Cameron was sitting down, his head in his hands. The investors were having a quiet conversation among themselves. I handed the folder to Richard, who opened it and began going through the contents methodically. Bank transfer confirmations showing $310,000 moved from Marcus J. Sullivan to Cameron R. Sullivan. Statements showing my savings account balance dropping from $297,000 to $42,000. A simple timeline I'd created showing the correlation between my transfer and the founding of Sullivan Digital Solutions. Richard took about 10 minutes to review everything, passing documents to the other investors as he finished with each one. Finally, he looked up at Cameron. Is this accurate? Did your father provide the initial capital for your company? Cameron's jaw was tight. For a moment, I thought he might still try to deny it, might try to spin some explanation. But something in him seemed to break. His shoulders sagged, and he nodded. Yes. My father gave me the money to start the company. And when I asked you directly about your initial funding source, You told me it was personal savings and cryptocurrency investments. That was a lie. It wasn't a question. Richard's voice wasn't angry, just stating a fact. Cameron didn't respond, just stared at the conference table. Jasmine closed the folder, pushed it back across the table toward me. Mr. Sullivan, thank you for bringing this to our attention. I want you to know that your son's lie wasn't just about taking credit for something he didn't do. It speaks to a fundamental issue of integrity that we consider when evaluating founders. We need to be able to trust the people we invest in. She turned to Cameron. Cameron, I want to be clear about something. The fact that your father funded your startup isn't the problem. Family funding is incredibly common in entrepreneurship, and there's absolutely no shame in it. What's a problem is that you deliberately misrepresented the source of that funding to us and, I'm guessing, to everyone else. You've spent years building a narrative about being self-made when you had significant family support. That's not just dishonest. It's disrespectful to your father and to every entrepreneur who actually does bootstrap from nothing. Cameron finally looked up, and I saw something in his face I hadn't seen in years: genuine shame. Not embarrassment of being caught, but actual understanding of what he'd done. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I'm sorry to all of you, and I'm sorry to my dad. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Here's what's going to happen. We're going to table this investment decision for now. We need to reassess based on this new information, and frankly, we need to think about whether we can trust your judgment and character going forward. We'll be in touch in a few weeks with our decision. The investors stood up, gathered their materials, and left. The entire meeting had taken less than 2 hours, but it felt like a lifetime had passed. When it was just Cameron and me in that conference room, surrounded by his carefully prepared presentation materials and the ruins of the narrative he built, he finally broke down. Not with anger, but with tears. Real tears that reminded me of the little boy who used to cry when he made mistakes, who used to come to me for comfort and guidance. Dad, I've ruined everything. They're not going to invest. Word is going to get around in the investor community. My reputation is destroyed. He was spiraling, catastrophizing, and I recognized it as the same pattern he'd had as a child when he made a mistake on a test or disappointed his mother. I sat down next to him, put my hand on his shoulder. Cameron, your reputation isn't destroyed, but the false reputation you built is gone, and that's a good thing. You can't build something real on a foundation of lies. He looked at me with red eyes. Why did you do that? Why did you embarrass me in front of my investors? And this was the moment I'd been preparing for. The moment where I had to help my son understand what had really happened. Son, I didn't embarrass you. I love you too much to let you continue down a path that was going to ultimately destroy you. Do you remember what your mother used to say? The truth will set you free, but first it will make you miserable. You needed to be set free from that lie. But I built this company. I worked 80-hour weeks. I grew the client base from nothing to 53 businesses. I hired and trained a team. That was all me, Dad. I did that work. I nodded. You absolutely did. And that's what makes this so tragic, Cameron. You accomplished something genuinely impressive. You took capital and turned it into a real business with real value. But instead of being proud of that accomplishment while also honoring the support you received, you tried to claim you did it all alone. Why? He was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, because in the entrepreneur world, nobody wants to hear that you had help. Everyone wants the story of the self-made founder who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. When I go to networking events or conferences, the people who got attention were the ones who talked about starting with nothing. I felt like if I admitted my dad gave me the money, people would dismiss what I'd accomplished. They'd say I had it easy. I understood then what had happened. My son had been trying to fit into a narrative that didn't match his reality, and in doing so, he'd erased the very foundation that made his success possible. Cameron, let me tell you something about the self-made myth. It's a lie that our culture tells to make successful people feel superior and unsuccessful people feel inadequate. Nobody is truly self-made. Every successful person had teachers, mentors, family members, opportunities, luck, or resources that helped them along the way. The difference is whether they acknowledge that help or pretend it didn't exist. But you worked night shifts for 30 years. Dad, you loaded packages in the middle of the night while other dads were sleeping in their beds. You gave me your retirement money. And I acted like none of that mattered, like it didn't even exist. His voice broke again. What kind of person does that? What kind of son am I? This was the moment of reckoning, the point where Cameron had to confront not just what he'd done, but who he'd become in the process. You're a son who made a mistake. A big one. But you're also a son who can choose right now to be different going forward. I pulled out my phone, opened his Instagram account, scrolled back through years of posts about being self-made, about building without handouts, about his solo journey. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to tell the truth, publicly. I want you to post the real story of how Sullivan Digital Solutions got started. And then I want you to live with integrity going forward, whatever that looks like for your business. Cameron stared at my phone screen, at his own carefully curated image looking back at him. They'll tear me apart in the comments. Other entrepreneurs will say I'm a fraud. I'll lose followers. I put my phone away. Maybe. Or maybe you'll inspire people by showing them that it's okay to have help, that there's no shame in family support, and that real strength comes from telling the truth, even when it's hard. But either way, you'll be free. You'll be living in reality instead of in a lie. We sat there for another hour, talking in a way we hadn't talked in years. Cameron told me about the pressure he'd felt to project success, about how the entrepreneurship world on social media had become a competition for who could claim the most dramatic rags to riches story. He told me about moments when he'd wanted to credit me, but talked himself out of it, rationalizing that it would hurt his brand. And I told him about watching his posts, about the pain of seeing no handouts and self-made over and over while I loaded trucks at 3 a.m. I saw you that night, you know, Cameron said suddenly, about 2 months ago. I was driving home from a late dinner, and I passed the UPS distribution center on North Side. I saw you in the parking lot, walking toward the building with your lunch bag, and I almost stopped. Almost pulled in to say hi, to thank you, to acknowledge what you've done for me. But I didn't. I just drove past because I didn't want to confront the gap between the story I was telling and the reality of what you were still doing for me. What do you mean, still doing for you? I asked. Cameron looked down. Dad, you're 58 years old. You should be thinking about retirement, about traveling, about enjoying life after Mom passed. But you're still working night shifts, still loading packages. And I know it's at least partly because I took your retirement money. I took your security, your freedom, your options. And then I pretended I'd earned everything on my own merit. He was right, of course. If I still had that $310,000, plus the compound interest and additional savings from the past 4 years, I'd have close to $400,000 right now. I could retire in a few years, could travel to places Patricia and I had always talked about visiting. But I'd made a choice, and I'd made it with open eyes. Cameron, I gave you that money because I believed in you and because I loved you. I don't regret that decision. What I regret is that you didn't honor the sacrifice that made your dream possible. That's what we're fixing right now. Over the next 3 weeks, I watched my son transform. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't immediate, but it was real. The first thing he did, 2 days after the board meeting, was post on Instagram. Not a defensive explanation or a half-hearted acknowledgement, but a genuine, detailed truth-telling. He posted a photo of himself and me from when he was in college, Patricia still alive, all of us smiling at his graduation. The caption was over 800 words long. It started. I need to tell you the truth about how Sullivan Digital Solutions was really started, and I need to apologize for a lie I've been living for 4 years. Every time I posted about being self-made, every time I talked about having no safety net or handouts, I was erasing the sacrifice of the person who made everything possible, my father, Marcus Sullivan. He went on to detail the entire story. The $310,000 transfer, my 32 years working night shifts at UPS, Patricia's death and the savings she'd left behind, his decision to build a self-made narrative instead of honoring the truth, and his recognition that this wasn't just about him, it was about every entrepreneur who felt inadequate because they didn't have the capital he pretended to accumulate alone. The post ended. I'm sorry to my father for erasing your sacrifice. I'm sorry to other entrepreneurs for perpetuating a harmful myth. And I'm sorry to everyone who believed in the image. I was projecting instead of the reality of who I am, someone who was given an extraordinary gift and should have been grateful enough to acknowledge it from day one. Going forward, I'm committed to telling the truth about entrepreneurship, including the parts that don't fit the Instagram highlight reel. The response was fascinating. He did lose some followers, about 3,000 in the first week. Some comments were harsh, calling him a fraud and a liar, but many more were supportive, even grateful. Hundreds of entrepreneurs commented about their own family support, their own struggles with the self-made pressure, their own gratitude for seeing someone tell the truth. The post was shared across Twitter, LinkedIn, and other platforms. Local Atlanta news picked it up. Within a week, Cameron had been invited to speak on a panel about authenticity in entrepreneurship. But more importantly than the public response was what happened privately. Cameron came to my house the Sunday after his post, and we cooked Patricia's Sunday dinner together, her famous pot roast with carrots and potatoes that she'd made almost every week of our marriage. While we cooked, we talked about what would happen with the business. The investors from that board meeting had ultimately decided not to move forward with their funding. Jasmine had called Cameron personally to explain that while they appreciated his honesty after being confronted, the fact that he'd maintained the lie for so long raised questions about his judgment. But she also said something that gave me hope. Cameron told me as he chopped carrots the exact way his mother had taught him. She said that if I could rebuild trust over the next year, if I could show consistent integrity in how I run the business and present myself, they'd be open to reconsidering. She said everybody deserves a chance at redemption, but redemption requires sustained change, not just a moment of confession. I asked him what he planned to do, and his answer showed me he'd really learned something. I'm going to run the company differently. No more pretending we're bigger than we are. No more lifestyle spending to project an image. I'm going to focus on serving our clients well and building something sustainable. And Dad, I want to do something else. I want to formalize your investment. I'm going to have my lawyer draw up proper documentation that gives you equity in the company and structures a repayment plan with interest. Not because you asked for it, but because it's right. You're not just my father. You're my founding investor, and you deserve to be treated as such. Over the next 8 months, I watched Cameron implement those changes. He moved the company out of the expensive Midtown office into a more modest space in East Atlanta. He sold a leased BMW and bought a used Toyota. He restructured his team, focusing on profitability rather than growth at all costs. And every month, he transferred $3,500 to my bank account, part principal repayment, part interest, and part the formal acknowledgement that I was an investor in his company. It wasn't a lot, but it was steady and it was real. By November of 2025, Sullivan Digital Solutions had 68 clients and was genuinely profitable. Cameron had been invited to speak at several conferences, not about being self-made, but about the importance of acknowledging support and building sustainable businesses. His Instagram following had actually grown past where it had been, but with a different audience, people who appreciated authenticity over performative success. And he'd started a mentorship program offering free consulting to young entrepreneurs who didn't have access to capital or family support. The most meaningful change, though, was in our relationship. Cameron started coming to Sunday dinner every week, a tradition we'd lost after Patricia died. We'd cook together, eat at the same kitchen table where he'd first asked me for that $310,000, and talk about business, life, and the future. He asked me about my work at UPS, actually seemed interested in the logistics and the people I worked with. He brought his girlfriend, Michaela, to meet me and told her the whole story of how his company started. He stopped performing and started being present. In March of 2026, almost exactly a year after that board meeting, Cameron did something that brought me to tears. He'd been working on a project in secret, and he invited me to his office to see the result. When I arrived, he walked me to a wall in the company's common area where employees took breaks and had meetings. There was a large frame photo I'd never seen before, Patricia and me at Cameron's Morehouse graduation, all three of us smiling, full of hope for the future. Below the photo was a plaque that read, "Sullivan Digital Solutions was founded on the love and sacrifice of Patricia and Marcus Sullivan. This company exists because they believed in possibility when it wasn't guaranteed, because they gave when they didn't have abundance to spare, and because they taught that real wealth is measured in relationships, not just revenue. We honor their legacy by serving our clients with integrity and by never forgetting where we came from. Every employee, every client, every person who walks into this office is going to know the truth," Cameron said, his arm around my shoulder. Not the myth I tried to create, but the real story of a father who worked night shifts for 32 years and a mother who saved every dollar she could, and a son who was given a gift he didn't deserve, but is trying every day to be worthy of. I stood there looking at Patricia's face, missing her desperately, but also feeling her presence. This was what she'd wanted, not just for Cameron to have opportunity, but for him to become a man of character. And standing there with my son, looking at the truth displayed on that wall, I knew we'd finally gotten there. The business secured a different round of funding in April 2026, this time from a Black-owned investment fund that was impressed by Cameron's turnaround and his commitment to authentic entrepreneurship. The investment was $1, $2 million smaller than the original deal, but enough to fuel sustainable growth. As part of the agreement, Cameron had to present the full history of the company's founding, including my initial investment. The investors loved the story, said it represented the kind of community support and family investment that had always been part of Black wealth building. As I'm telling you this story now, in December of 2026, I'm 59 years old. I'm still working at UPS, still loading packages on the night shift, but by choice now rather than necessity. Cameron's monthly payments have rebuilt my savings to $127,000, and between that and my UPS pension, I'll be able to retire comfortably in a few years. More importantly, I have my son back. Not the Instagram version, not the self-made CEO persona, but the real Cameron, flawed, learning, growing, and finally living with integrity. The lesson I want to leave you with, if you've made it this far in the story, is this: karma isn't about revenge. It's not about destroying people who wrong you. It's about truth eventually demanding to be told, about consequences naturally flowing from our choices. I didn't destroy my son's business or his reputation. I simply refused to let a lie continue, and that refusal created space for him to become who he was actually capable of being. The most powerful thing you can do when someone takes your sacrifice for granted isn't to punish them. It's to hold up a mirror and make them see the truth clearly enough that they choose to change. And to those of you who are working jobs that nobody sees, making sacrifices that nobody acknowledges, supporting people who don't always say thank you, your work matters. Your sacrifice is real. And whether or not the people you're supporting acknowledge it in the moment, the truth has a way of being revealed. Stay patient, stay dignified, and trust that integrity, in the end, is more valuable than any image you could construct. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being here. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this. And drop a comment letting me know, have you ever had to choose between keeping peace and telling the truth? How did you handle it? I read every comment, and your stories matter to me. My name is Marcus Jonathan Sullivan. I'm 59 years old. I work night shift at UPS in Atlanta, and I'm proud to be my son's founding investor. Not because of the money, but because in the end, we both chose truth over image. And that made all the difference.